All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jorge Acosta Palmer, and I'm the Director of the Statewide Training Initiative for Florida Legal Services. We're excited to have you join us today for Breaking Free, Legal Relief for Forced Criminality and Consumer Debt in Human Trafficking Cases. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to go through some quick housekeeping announcements. This training is being recorded. You're going to receive a copy of this recording in an email from Zoom, not from me. It's going to come from Zoom within 24 hours. If you don't see that email, no worries. Just let me know. I'm going to drop my email into the chat just in case. Feel free to reach out to me if you missed that email. This training was approved by the Florida Bar for one general and one criminal trial and criminal appellate law certification credits. I'll announce the CLE code towards the end of the session. I'll also drop the code into the chat, and I will also include the code in the email from the Zoom in the recording. The training will also be posted on YouTube, so I'll include the CLE code on the YouTube description as well. Closed captions are enabled for anybody who needs them. If you're having any issues with accessibility or the captions, you can reach out to me directly. This training is being co-hosted by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, or PILS. If you're not familiar with PILS, I encourage you to take a look at their website and look at all the subject matter areas that and the committees that we have. Definitely has a lot of benefits to folks that work in these type of areas. And final piece of housekeeping announcements, questions and answers. We do have the Q&A feature, so if you do have any questions, we ask you to please use the Q&A feature. You can actually post questions anonymously, and we're going to try to answer questions towards the end of the session. If we see that your question is directly related to the topic, we'll do our best to address the question at that moment. And since this is the last item of housekeeping announcements, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Brent Woody. Brent is an attorney licensed in Florida and Tennessee and the founder and executive director of the Justice Restoration Center. Since 2009, Brent has made it a personal mission to provide free legal services to victims and survivors of human trafficking. Understanding that individuals subjected to exploitation in the forms of forced labor, commercial sex acts, and domestic servitude had no means to obtain desperately needed legal services. Brent committed to never turning away a survivor with trafficking related legal needs. In 2012, Brent's work for trafficking survivors and victims expanded as he began advocating before the Florida legislature for the rights of human trafficking survivors to petition a court for the expungement of criminal history records and vacating of criminal convictions for offenses that resulted from their exploitation. Unjust criminal history records and convictions closed many doors for trafficking survivors, and this law was desperately needed. At that time, Brent already had two survivor clients with such a need. Florida passed the Human Trafficking Victim Expungement Law, and the governor signed it into law. The governor signed it into law in 2013. By the time the law took effect in January 2014, Justice Restoration Center had 15 trafficking expungement clients. JRC now represents over 200 survivors from in and out the state and from within the Florida inmate population. Brent has initiated and successfully advocated for, among other things, the elimination of the statute of limitations for human trafficking offenses, enhanced penalties for traffickers, enhanced penalties for sex buyers, and the non-criminalization of commercially sexually exploited minors, and exemptions from the public records law for the locations of safe houses. And before I pass it on to Brent, quick reminder, this is January, which just happens to be Human Trafficking Prevention Awareness Month. So without further ado, I want to pass it on to Brent. Brent, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, Jorge. Thanks for being such a great host, and I am always excited to talk about this topic. It is kind of near and dear to our hearts because of the depth and the nature of some of the remedies that are available for human trafficking survivors. As Jorge mentioned, here I can, yeah, we provide no-cost legal services to victims and survivors of human trafficking. We do work exclusively in that space. I know there's a lot of intersection with domestic violence and other types of issues, but we've really had to limit our scope to the human trafficking space. So we do, and as we grow, have more and more clients, that's actually been a good decision for us. We have clients that are literally located all over the world, certainly Florida, Tennessee, and again, related to matters that are resulting from their commercial exploitation. We are part of the National Survivor Law Collective, which is, you might think has, 25 members, but there's four of us at this point. There are so few attorneys who are working exclusively in the human trafficking space. And honestly, not that many that are working just on human trafficking issues alongside other practice areas. So we need, we really need an army of attorneys to step into so many of these spaces, so many of these legal issues. The gaps in legal services for trafficking survivors are pretty profound. We also do trafficking related care management, we kind of call it. That's kind of quasi legal, or not, it's not illegal, but it's sort of non-legal services, working on safe prison release for inmates that were previously trafficked, getting our clients, or maybe just calls that come into our office, getting people connected to safe housing situations, getting connected to therapy, employment, which of course what we're talking about today has a huge bearing on employment opportunities. And we partner with, just many other service providers, because for one thing, we can only do this, and it really does take a village. And, honestly, there's value in collaboration. I'm sure many of you work in collaborative uh, situations with service providers and the like, and there's a real value in just doing that as an approach. Also, as Jorge mentioned, our work in the legislative space in Florida and Tennessee and federal, and consulting with other states as they move forward with some of their legislation. So I thought it might be good to kind of just summarize, and again, forgive me for some of this may be very familiar to y'all, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of go through, what are some of the human trafficking related legal issues that happen. Usually one of the first thing that comes to mind is the state and federal criminal arrest records. And those are records that, typically have come about, again, as a result of their trafficking because of being forced into certain conduct, whether that's in a sex trafficking situation, prostitution, or it could be forced into, other types of things that we'll talk about in a little more detail. Certainly coerced debt in debt bondage, and we are going to talk about the Debt Bondage Repair Act a little later on, but that's a common scenario. Bankruptcy, sometimes when the sort of the depth of the financial things can't be untangled, sometimes bankruptcy is an option. And there are unique challenges with bankruptcy if, in order to keep the bankruptcy clients' identity private, some things like that are unique in that space. Family law matters, a huge area that is we just do not have enough attorneys that will or can step into those custody battles or marital situations, that type of thing. A lot of things to unwind there. You know, constantly coordinating out of state counsel, because our clients may have been trafficked in multiple states, and so we're working with out of state attorneys to get them connected to the appropriate legal assistance. Active warrants, I suppose that maybe goes without saying, related to the criminal arrest records. Intellectual property rights, which isn't necessarily the thing that immediately comes to people's minds when you think about human trafficking victims, but survivors, in their sort of recovery or restoration journey at some point may create proprietary content, there are trademarks that may come about if they are starting businesses or things like that related to their lived experience and their expertise. Immigration, obviously, y'all really familiar with that, although I just maybe should say ahead of time that 99% of our clients are from the US. So we don't often have immigration issues on this side of it, but certainly that's obviously a thing. Federal tax matters, which you, especially you consumer attorneys will be possibly familiar with, where our client has maybe danced in a strip club somewhere and there was money paid, there's a 1099. Our client didn't keep any of the money because it all went to the trafficker. Our client's being trafficked in multiple jurisdictions, so the 1099 doesn't even get to them. And then years later, the IRS comes back for, with a huge tax debt. So working through those things and the unique challenges that the situation that arise in that situation. I'm going to talk some today about expungement of Florida criminal arrest records. And I'm probably, I'm going to drill down on it as much as I can. As we'll kind of see as we go through it, it can be, a little bit complex, not in the sense of where it's complex in the sense that there are can be a lot of moving parts in this. And so we'll kind of talk through what this looks like. Some of you may have done one of these or more. If so, jump in the Q&A and let us know what your experience was, or you can enlighten me on things that I don't talk about today. So definitely the issue, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, human trafficking commonly results in a criminal record. Those things can be prostitution's kind of the one thing that comes to mind, because even still today, some of our law enforcement partners are still arresting individuals who are more than likely a victim of human trafficking, but they're still arresting them in human trafficking stings or prostitution stings. So they acquire a criminal record as a result of that. Drug-related crimes, another thing that's fairly obvious, because traffickers use drugs. They use addiction to control victims, to keep them doing what the trafficker is telling them to do. The the victims may have brought an addiction to the table. That's a vulnerability that actually, again, makes them more susceptible to the control of a trafficker, and the trafficker just uses that to get them to do, basically what the trafficker needs them to do. Theft crimes, very common. In fact, maybe, I don't know, it's a big percentage of the types of charges that we expunge. And some of that, we'll talk a little bit about forced criminality in a few minutes, but that's a big one. Battery, sometimes we have battery on law enforcement, or maybe things that result again from the various trafficking situations. DUIs, which can result from a trafficker forcing a victim to drive to a strip club or drive to an out call or a prostitution date. Or sometimes the trafficker will just force them to drive the trafficker around, so the trafficker doesn't get pulled over. So it's that's something that we see fairly common. Again, kind of intuitive here that the consequences of a criminal record, employment barrier, is, in my view, probably the most profound barrier, because so many other things hinge on that ability to have sustainable employment. And we'll talk about this as well a little bit later, but the getting out of the cycle of vulnerability and the cycle of exploitation can really hinge on this employment piece. So to the extent that a criminal record prevents, um, employment in the most menial jobs sometimes, but also, prevents, um, one's ability to pass a level two background check. So working in the social services, um, various things like that, or moving into even, from an educational standpoint, uh, going to law school and character and fitness backgrounds, that kind of thing. There's so much that hinges on this employment piece. Housing, certainly safe housing, housing that doesn't put a survivor in the position of being exploited or re-exploited through the housing situation. So by a less than, uh, upstanding landlord or property manager who decides, oh, they have a criminal record, I'll give them a place to live, but in exchange for sexual favors or some sort of um, inappropriate financial penalty. So again, housing, many times they have kids, or survivors have kids or a kid. Again, safe housing, getting a part of getting them out of the life and avoiding further exploitation. Education, of course, is a huge thing, and many survivors want to go into nursing or the medical field or the social services, teaching. So there are many things that with a criminal record they cannot pursue. They can't even do internships in the education space. Family law, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the consequences of a criminal record. Of course, those of you who do family law will know uh, how that can impact various kinds of family law cases. I I will, in case I don't mention it later, when we talk about the results or the sort of the upshot of an expunged record, that can be expungement can be a huge benefit to family law situations when we're able to remove that criminal record. Same thing with immigration. So we have immigration problems that may arise with our clients sometimes because of a criminal record and putting them in a deportable position, but the expungement of the record, because it is a substantive remedy, can sometimes remove those features that make them deportable. So uh, volunteerism, whether that's uh, in the community or with maybe their children's school, being chaperone, various things like that. The criminal record can interrupt and prevent those kind of activities. Obviously, civic participation, voting, gun ownership, all those things that go along with that. What we know from the research from the Avery Center is that 90% of human trafficking victims exit the life with a criminal record, and that 90% with a criminal record will live in poverty the rest of their lives. So it's a very, very consequential issue. Um, some of the non-legal consequences of a criminal record, and some of which we didn't actually think much about when we were in the process of drafting and passing our expungement law. The stigma of arrest, the stigma of a criminal record, kind of along with that, the shame, the low self-esteem, the feeling of inadequacy, things like that that are just it's kind of another layer of trauma, another layer of the challenge of recovering and restoring from human trafficking. And we've seen it now, of course, for over a decade, how our clients feel about themselves as a result of the arrest record, even though legally they shouldn't have been culpable. They shouldn't have been arrested. And being in that position is not their fault. Nonetheless, those feelings are there, and those feelings themselves create a barrier to restoration and recovery. Criminal records can be re-traumatizing. As as a survivor looks at her or his record, it can remind them of the things that were happening at that time. The individuals involved in the arrest, even the presence of law enforcement, which if they've had negative encounters with law enforcement, can be huge trauma triggers, as well as again that other layer of trauma. Criminal records affect family relationships. Sometimes extended family don't understand what happened. They don't understand human trafficking. They don't. They just think it's the survivor's fault, and she shouldn't have been in that situation. She shouldn't have been doing drugs, and so it's victim blaming. That's a whole other area to untangle in terms of those familial relationships, but that criminal record can be a kind of a fixed or a permanent reminder and problem with that. Expungement can remove that and can also illustrate to the family that doesn't understand what happened, can illustrate and show that the survivor should not have been criminalized. And then social, friendships, social pieces of that. I had a client who we expunged her record. It was a significant record. And a couple of years later, she called one afternoon and had gotten pulled over in another state. And for whatever reason, her record hadn't been removed from the national database. It came up. She was with friends who did not know anything about her background. And so she was cuffed, and because a felony came up, and that kind of thing can happen. So she was, that was a defect in this whole process that we're going to talk about, which shouldn't have happened to begin with. But also she was moving on with her life, new friends, new people that just didn't know about her background. So it was very difficult. So we talked about being stuck in this cycle of arrest. And so, I'm going to use kind of a sex trafficking scenario to just kind of illustrate how you get arrested. And let's say you get arrested for prostitution, but it could be a drug crime or really anything. So you're kind of forced to exit the exploitation, at least for a minute, and be in be in jail, and then you get out. And so, either the case is resolved, the trafficker bonds them out, or for whatever reason, they're able to get out. But let's say they get out and they don't immediately go back to the trafficker doesn't pursue them, but they can't get hired for reasons we talked about. They can't find housing, so they're not necessarily in a safe situation. They end up with just a lack of meaningful choices. They don't know where to go next, what to do next, maybe haven't had an opportunity to connect with a service provider who can maybe help them navigate some of that. And so they end up, I don't know, go back into a strip club because they can have quick and easy money there, but that's right back into the portal to re-exploitation. Happens again, they get arrested again. And we see, we had a client in another county who had 50 or over 50 cases, and a majority of those were prostitution over, a 10-year period of time. It was just a revolving door. And so it just becomes this cycle. So it's like a practical cycle, right? Because of these lack of choices that result, but it's also an emotional cycle. So at some point, there's questions, is there hope of even breaking this cycle? Do they even know that they can somehow break this cycle? And uh, we have clients who were trafficked for 30 years, in part because of this. The arrests were part of what kept them in that place. So thankfully, in 2013, and I don't even have a background in criminal law. Maybe I shouldn't say this because this is a CLE related to criminal practice. But prior to 2012, I started in 2012. My background is in civil practice and intellectual property and that sort of thing. And but I had started working in this human trafficking space, in 2010 or so, and getting to know survivors and starting to understand some of their challenges. In 2012, I um, I kind of came across this as a fairly new thing. I came across this criminal record issue, looking at some things that were happening in New York and a law that New York had passed to address this issue. And of course, when you hear about it, you're like, well, yeah, of course, criminal record, all the things that we've talked about. But it hadn't been on my radar. So I had a law school friend who was planning to run for Florida legislature, and he had told me if I get elected, I want to know about human trafficking. I want to know more and find out what we can do. And so he did get elected. And in the meantime, I had obtained tons of information from the New York attorneys who were working in this space and had helped pass this law. Uh, so I was able to work with my friend, Ross Spano was his name, who was a freshman member of that Florida House, and sent him all this information, and he sponsored this bill. We redrafted, worked with stakeholders. I was the most unlikely person to be involved in this, even though I had a political science degree. I didn't know anything about this process, how this worked. Um, uh, but somehow it did work. And passing laws is crazy. It's a wonder it ever happens, I think, looking back on it. But somehow we had unanimous support of stakeholders. Uh, and we just ended up passing an incredible law in hindsight, even though we've had to fix a number of things with it. Um, it just provided a profound remedy, and we'll talk about some of the features of this law in a little bit. Passed in 2013. Legislature gave FDLE and some folks some time to kind of ramp up their systems to be able to accommodate these different types of expungement. And enacted in 2014, we did the first one in 2014, and we've amended it through the years, which we'll talk about a little bit. Um, so yeah, we had no idea. When we did the first one, we didn't even know how to do it. I mean, there was a little bit of a pathway, some statutory guidance as to some required things. We didn't know how the state would respond. It was going to be brand new to everybody, to the state, to the court, to law enforcement. Somehow the first one went through actually really easily, and we were certainly pleased to see that. So yeah, again, amended some things through the years. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I think it may be wise to just kind of provide this sort of caveat that as many of you will know, there are other kinds of expungement in Florida. So we have this one, which is 943.0583, but then we have what we call sort of standard expungement or traditional, and then there's an administrative expungement. In some respects, in most respects, these are actually nothing alike. And we'll talk about the differences, but the sort of critical advantages of human trafficking expungement is that it vacates any convictions that are associated with the expunged record. So that's your substantive remedy. So we'll talk about the consequences of expungement, but it will undo um, probation, court fines, any of those things that are going on as a result of the criminal record. It will wipe those out. So it's a substantive remedy, vacating the convictions, uh, and then the disclosure of the expunged record is only required in two instances, which is if you're a defendant in a future case, and we probably don't even need to have that. We might want to change that. And if you are applying for a position with law enforcement, in those cases, you do have to disclose. But all other situations, you do not have to disclose the arrest if it's been expunged under 9430583. And that is, that's a lot. So it's always preferable to do this type of expungement than the traditional or standard, which honestly, in most human trafficking situations, that's not going to be a viable a remedy. So we'll talk a little bit about the process. And we're going to drill down a little bit on this, but certainly the sort of that threshold issue is determining their eligibility for expungement under the human trafficking expungement statute. That's going to involve gathering information. Generally, we try to do that in writing because of the trauma pieces that are involved. And if we have to get to know their story or their trafficking experience on a super detailed level, it's best to do that in a situation that the client can control, and the client has some control when it's up to them to write it. And so that is how we, other than some just very initial questions about their situation and that kind of thing, we will really drill down on these things in writing. And that has proven to be a much more trauma-informed way of doing this. Of course, you have to determine where to file it. So where is the criminal record? Technically, the statute provides that you can file a petition to expunge in the circuit where the arrest occurred. So theoretically, you could file, if you had an arrest in Pasco County, you should be able to file it in Pinellas County because we're in the Sixth Circuit, both counties. However, the clerks don't really like that. So we kind of still file in the county where the arrest occurred and where the arrest record is sort of housed in that clerk's office. So prepare the pleadings, documents to be filed. We'll get a little more detail on that, but you file the petition package and wait for the state's response, which of course you hope is a non-objection, or sometimes they'll stipulate to it. In rare instances, they'll oppose it. And then, on to the next step, which is either a hearing, which hearings are very rare in this space. Typically, if there's a stipulation or a non-objection, if the state agrees with the proposed order, the court will enter the order. And then you start talking about what happens after expungement. So, but I want to drill down on a few of these details and talk about the eligibility for expungement. And these seem maybe intuitive or kind of obvious on the surface, but getting below the surface can be all so important in these expungement petitions. So the petitioner must have been a victim of human trafficking, right? So it's a human trafficking victim expungement law. The offense that you're trying to expunge or seeking to expunge must be an eligible offense. We'll talk about that. The nexus, there has to be a nexus between human trafficking, a connection between human trafficking and the arrest or conviction that you're trying to expunge. And you have to do it with due diligence, which is basically, if you know about your rights, you shouldn't sit on them for a long period of time. That has never in 12 years, so 11 years, I guess, that's never come up. Simply because there's way too many reasons why somebody would delay: lack of knowledge, lack of finding an attorney, um, maybe being in a continuing trafficking situation. There are many reasons why it could take a long time. And that due diligence language, I think, was probably, it was borrowed from another statute somewhere. And nonetheless, it's there. And uh, I think I'm sure many of you, maybe all of you, have a good handle on what is human trafficking. So I don't mean to get, I don't want to get, too basic here, but because it is the threshold question for whether or not a client is eligible for this relief. It's so important that the screening part, the determining of whether or not they were involved in human trafficking, is of utmost importance. Because if you miss that, they may be a trafficking victim. They may not identify as a trafficking victim. Law enforcement may not have identified them as a victim. There may be nothing other than their own narrative that indicates that they were a trafficking victim. Therefore, you have to understand what that narrative is telling you, because you may not get it from anywhere else. So we know that human trafficking is a crime, basically, exploiting a person for labor, services, or commercial sex. Normally kind of breaking down, and there are other types of trafficking, but sex trafficking and labor trafficking is pretty well covers, most of these things. You have domestic servitude, which can be brought under the labor trafficking piece. So for us, it's easiest to kind of break it into these two areas. Florida statute, person subjected to coercion as defined in 787.06 for the purpose of being used in human trafficking, or a child under 18 years of age subjected to human trafficking, or an individual subjected to human trafficking as defined by federal law. So that's in the expungement statute. That basically says, here's who is a victim of human trafficking for purposes of expungement. And what this does is it kind of gives you two avenues to determine whether somebody is a human trafficking victim: on the state level and on the federal level. And they're not identical. So it's important to understand what is a human trafficking victim on either of or both of those, so that you make sure you're kind of covering all the possibilities. And we talk in federal law in terms of severe forms of trafficking in persons, basically sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. So that does share the state and federal in terms of adult sex trafficking coming about as a result of coercion, or a minor, under 18 years old. Anyone involved in a commercial sexual activity is a per se human trafficking victim, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then on the labor trafficking side, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. So again, kind of moving on to the labor trafficking side there, even though there's some different labels for that. I do want to just raise this issue here of, is prostitution itself human trafficking? And again, we're not talking about what is our what's our sociological viewpoint of that, or how do we feel about that, or what do various groups think about that. The question is, what does the law say about that? And under the federal statute, It defines sex trafficking. Um, it means the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. There's no coercion language in this particular part of the statute. It just defines sex trafficking as basically prostitution or other commercial sexual activity. Who, in the same statute, who is a victim of trafficking? The term victim of trafficking means a person subjected to an act or practice described in paragraph 11 or 12. And so we see this is paragraph 12. So in our view, from a legal standpoint, you can make the argument that any prostitution is human trafficking. It's sex trafficking. That can be considered a stretch. And if you have a case like that, the state may push back and say, well, this was willing prostitution. This wasn't human trafficking. You may, if you want to, press in on that, you may be able to lean on this statute. Also, really important to know the federal definition of coercion, which is in 18 U.S. Code Section 1591, threats of serious harm to or physical restraint against any person, any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act would result in serious harm to or physical restraint against any person or the abuse of law or the legal process. I've italicized serious harm because it's really important to know what that means. And again, this is statutory and the federal it's a federal statute. The term serious harm means any harm, whether physical or non-physical, including psychological, financial, or reputational harm that is sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances to perform or to continue performing commercial sexual activity. There's a corresponding statute for labor trafficking in order to avoid incurring that harm. So the standard isn't how you or I might react or understand the situation. It's the victim. It's the victim's view of and the vulnerabilities, the circumstances that victim is in. The trafficker basically takes that victim as they are, and so we have to be careful to put ourselves in that spot or think of that ordinary person standard, that sort of thing. This is the standard, and so that serious harm definition is really important. Grooming. So if someone's being groomed for future human trafficking, are they a trafficking victim during that grooming process? And there's a civil case, the Riccio case, that basically said yes, they were a human trafficking victim for the purposes of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act during the grooming process, because the statute is if they're being obtained, recruited, solicited, all that for the purpose of human trafficking. So, excuse me. So that is that grooming process. So you've got to look at, okay, maybe your client was never involved in a transaction, but they were being groomed for the purpose of a future transaction. They can be a human trafficking victim during that time, and then if there was a criminal offense that occurred during that time, it could be expungable. Quickly, direct or power-based, and these are just things we made up in terms of what to call this, but these are human trafficking situations, sex trafficking situations involving adults where you don't have a third-party trafficker. So, and you can look these cases up. These are a couple of district court opinions. U.S. v. Zacharias was a priest situation. So you had a priest who abused two boys. And then the boys grew into adults. And the priest used his control and the boys' addiction as adults, used that to control them, and they provided sexual favors to the priest in exchange for money for the drugs. So you had all the elements of a human trafficking crime: the obtaining of the individuals, the means, which was the coercion, through withholding money or not giving them money for the drugs that they had to have, and then the purpose, which was commercial sex act, because of what the boys, again, as adults, provided to the priest. U.S. v. Johnson, another federal case, and these are citations. Again, if you need to use these to build your case in terms of expungement, in these kind of situations, as a practical matter, where we see this are law enforcement who will exchange a non-arrest for a sex act. We know we have a lawyer in jail, been in jail for a number of years now, on criminal or on human trafficking charges, part of which was exchanging legal services, critical legal services, in exchange for sex. The coercion piece, of course, is if you don't do this for me, I'm not going to represent you. You're just going to go to jail. And then another case involving a doctor who was providing cancer treatments, but would only do so if the patient would provide nude pictures to the doctor. Patient could not afford cancer treatments. He was the only option. And so again, you have all three elements of human trafficking there. Super easy one to miss. Violent sex buyer could also be a trafficker as well, because there's a coercion piece. Forced criminality. Forced criminality is actually fairly simple concept, that if you're forced into being involved in criminal conduct by someone else for the benefit of that other person, that's forced criminality. We have a state case that basically affirms that forced criminality is a form of labor trafficking. So very often we'll see forced criminality in sort of a context of a sex trafficking scenario, but there may not, that particular individual or client may not have been involved in sex trafficking, or the commercial sexual part of the sex trafficking. And so, but they're forced to do all kinds of other things: shoplift for the trafficker, carry his drugs, drive him. We talked about DUI earlier. So that forced criminality, that's a labor trafficking piece there, and of course eligible for expungement under the statute. But just a couple of distinctions there here. Federal child labor trafficking requires force, fraud, or coercion for the child. Then this is labor trafficking. Florida child labor trafficking does not require coercion. That was removed at the same time that coercion was removed as a requirement for child sex trafficking. So important to remember, that was kind of our case. That previous case I mentioned, the Williams case, that was the situation there. And then really important for commercial sexual activity, this is from our human trafficking criminal statute, in which any child younger than 18 years of age or an adult believed by the person to be a child younger than 18 years of age, or in which any person who is mentally defective or mentally incapacitated, as those terms are defined in statute, they come under the child trafficking sort of cover, not the adult trafficking. And that means that coercion isn't required. So if you have a mental, I dislike these terms, but they're statutory, mentally defective or mentally incapacitated individual who was involved in prostitution and maybe was arrested for prostitution, the arrest for prostitution is the evidence that they were human trafficking victims, because the coercion isn't required. So they're per se human trafficking victims. So really, really important to not miss that. Let's talk about, and I can see right now we're maybe in trouble time-wise, but let's talk about eligible offense. So that's any offense except those listed in 775-084, which is basically these, mostly or really altogether violent offenses, which cannot be expunged under the human trafficking statute. They should be. We should be able to expunge these as well, because many of these types of cases, they just are a direct result of the control of the trafficker. So, but these were kind of, from a compromise standpoint, were the ones that were left out initially. Important to note that even an arrest for any of these cannot be expunged, and that's something we are trying to fix and have been trying for 3 or 4 years now. Because even if you were arrested for robbery and not even charged, we still cannot expunge that, and that's wrong. We should be able to do that. Again, the offenses must have been committed or reported to have been committed while the person was a victim of trafficking, as a part of a trafficking scheme of which the person was a victim, or at the direction of an operator of the scheme. That's fairly just kind of, again, obvious. You cannot have a human trafficking situation and then the situation stops and 5 years later there's a DUI or something. It could be the DUI resulted from the trauma or whatever, but there's not a sufficient nexus to be able to include that DUI in the petition. Again, petition must be filed with due diligence after the victim ceased to be a victim of human trafficking or sought services, subject to reasonable concerns for the safety of the victim, family members of the victim, or other victims. So there are many reasons why it might take a long time for someone to exercise their right to file a petition. Okay, really important here, again, if you're not familiar, there are no limitations on how many arrests or convictions may be expunged. That means we've had as many, I know we've had in excess of 50 cases that were expunged in a single petition. Multiple circuits, there just is no limit. Even if you have a client who you expunge her record and God forbid she goes back in the life and she gets another record, her first expungement should be invisible, first of all, and it's not relevant to a future expungement, and it doesn't prevent it. So it matters not how many. There's no limit. You can certainly file now. We fix this in statute in multiple circuits at the same time. Used to be you had to say that you didn't have any other pending petition to expunge. We realized for human trafficking victim that didn't matter. So, and then legal standards for judicial determination with official documentation, and we could spend honestly 2 hours on just talking about official documentation. Excuse me. But it is essentially documentation that tends to show that the petitioner was a victim of human trafficking. So that could be a police report, it could be a victim testimony in a case against a trafficker. We interpret it to mean it could be an agency like a NGO who has made a determination that the person they're working with is a trafficking victim. When you have that official documentation submitted along with a petition, you have a preponderance of the evidence proof standard. That's one thing that results from that. The other is that it creates a legal presumption that the petitioner was a human trafficking victim and that the record that you're seeking to expunge resulted from human trafficking. So it actually shifts the burden to the state to be able to show that they were not a human trafficking victim. So that official documentation is really important if you can find it, if you have it. Without official documentation, you have a clear and convincing evidence standard, and we've been trying to change that in the statute for quite a while, unsuccessfully so far. The documents that get filed, survivor's sworn statement, petition to expunge, official documentation if there is any, notice of confidential information, and really important because as of last year, 2024, I think in January, the statutory exemption from public records was placed in Rule 2.420, which means that pleadings and documents related to human trafficking expungement are automatically confidential. So put that notice of confidential information, cite the rule, and everything you file after that point should be confidential. You have to keep up with the clerk's office to make sure that happens. No FDLE certificate of eligibility. It's not required. Nothing about this process has anything to do with FDLE on the front end. It certainly does on the back end. Your client has to provide information about what happened, and you're gathering documents. There could, in some situations, the state may want to interview your client. Avoid that if you can, but sometimes if you don't have documentation and all you have is the client's testimony, that may occur. Your clients will be concerned about how long it'll take. There's no great answer to that. Will they have to appear in court or testify? That answer is no. Information will be confidential. And then, of course, what happens if you win or lose? I'm going to skip over here real quick because I want to get to the Debt Bondage Repair Act if we can. Basically, completing the legal process, we get an order from the judge. Your expungement obliterates the arrest record. The clerk seals it. FDLE seals it. Your client can lawfully deny the arrest with those two exceptions I talked about earlier. Important is it vacates any underlying conviction if there was a conviction. Sometimes you just have an arrest record and no conviction. When you vacate the conviction, remember it's substantive, so it impacts scoring, it impacts fines, it impacts probation, impacts immigration because it's a substantive on the merits vacature. As I said, eliminates fines, probation, warrants, even incarceration in one of our cases where our client had served 4 years and have an 11-year sentence, expunged the record. There's no conviction, so she's out. So it's really, from a legal standpoint, really profound remedies as a result of that. Fine refunds, again, we could spend quite a while. So I encourage you to look at these cases. So Nelson v. Colorado was a U.S. Supreme Court case that said, hey, when a conviction is invalidated or vacated, the state can't keep the money, the fine money and court costs that the defendant paid. The state has to give that money back. So we began to make, after this case, claims for return of the money. We were getting it from the clerk's office. Clerk's office pushed back in Hillsborough County and litigated this second DCA case, which you can read the case. Unfortunately, we feel like the court got it wrong. We've been working ever since to try to fix this legislatively. Post-expungement concerns. I have 1 minute left. I'm going to move forward here really quickly. I want to talk about this Debt Bondage Repair Act because, and your consumer, maybe you all know about this, but your consumer lawyers certainly probably do. But this is exclusively for human trafficking victims. It's a whole different kind of relief for them. It's federal. Has to do with adverse items on a credit report, and their ability to remove those adverse items. It's a fairly simple process. Submitting proof of identity, documentation of their status as a trafficking victim, which does have some limitations to it, and then the identification of what specific information should be blocked. The CRA, the credit reporting agencies, are set up to receive these petitions. I guess they're not really petitions, but they're just submissions to get this kind of relief. We've used it very successfully. here are the CRA's duties, and I could, if you want more information on this, I'm happy to give it to you. But it doesn't do anything substantively. So if you have an eviction that occurred as a result of the financial issues created by your trafficking, that eviction can be 10 years later. So that nexus is it's a different way of looking at that connection than it is in our expungement statute. But you do have the ability to remove that eviction from your credit record. However, it doesn't do anything legally to the substantive debt. So in other words, Discover card that your trafficker used in your name or whatever that ended up on your credit report, you can remove it from your credit report, but the debt will still be there, and that's then a matter of negotiating, working that out with the creditor. So it's super robust remedy. It can increase your client's credit score, by 100 points in one submission. So really important. I just wanted to mention that. And again, the duties. So we're at 101. I'm going to kind of pass over the myths and misinformation, and I guess we'll kind of, Jorge, if we could maybe jump to any questions. But this PowerPoint will be available, and certainly welcome you to reach out to me anytime. We love this process, and we'll do anything we can to help survivors, be able to obtain this.
We do have one question here. If a criminal record is sealed and or expunged, a person still needs to disclose the crime when applying for immigration relief, correct? Immigration forms ask about crimes, so if you can clarify.
So here's what my take would be on that. That requirement to disclose is going to be, it's not covered under state law. So the expungement statute says here are the two instances you have to disclose. But in my view, that wouldn't necessarily apply in the immigration context because that's going to be a federal thing. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think there's a distinction, and you immigration attorneys would know better whether or not it would be required. However, even if it is disclosed, again, it's been substantively vacated. So it in our experience has been that immigration courts readily acknowledge, oh, this has been vacated as a substantive matter on the merits. Therefore, it's not a component of deportation, if that makes sense. Is that like a super wishy-washy answer? I didn't mean for it to be, but that's my best take because you just got that interplay between federal immigration law and state law.
That was a great question. I don't see any other open questions. We are past 1 o'clock, so I just wanted to thank you all for joining us here today. We hope this session provided, valuable insights and strategies for your work in assisting survivors. A special thank you to our amazing speaker, Brent Woody from Justice Restoration Center. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your insights and the incredible work you do in this field. Your dedication for advocating for survivors is truly inspiring. So I do want to remind the group that the training was approved for CLE credit. And I will go ahead and drop the CLE code here one more time. And I'm going to read it out loud just in case. It's 24140138. Be on the lookout for an email from Zoom within 24 hours with this information. We will also post a copy of the recording on YouTube in case somebody was unable to register to make sure that people have access to this great training. So thank you again, Brent, and everybody
Thank you.
have a great rest of your day.